Good afternoon, Helsinki. It's my first time in Finland, and it's great to be here. I want to start with a story. When I was young, I had a tradition with my father. On the way to school, we would drive in traffic, and there were these magazine and newspaper hawkers on the side, and we would buy newspapers and magazines, and I'd have to read them for about an hour before I'd get to school. My favorite at the time was The Economist. It opened my world up to this ecosystem where I could read and learn about what's going on in Asia, understand what's going on in Europe. I could learn about the whole world without traveling from where I was in Accra. So I loved The Economist. I'll never forget this particular day where we were driving and I saw this. I remember looking at the magazine, pitch dark background, a man holding a grenade launcher, and I asked my father, why do they think we're hopeless? How could a magazine in one sweep render an entire continent of 1 billion people the hopeless continent? In almost a mea culpa, a decade later, the same magazine what had changed in 10 years? What had changed that had accounted for such a radical, different picture and depiction of the continent? I don't think either of these two covers do justice to Africa. It is a varied, rich, diverse, complex, and complicated continent of 54 different countries. And what I'm hoping to share with you today is to give you a little window into the transformation of the continent through the eyes of entrepreneurs. But first, a little bit of background on me. I'm an entrepreneur and an investor. I've been building and investing in businesses across the continent for the past 10 years. I've traveled, and when I speak of Africa, some people will go to Kenya and will tell me, oh, I was just in Africa. And I'm like, no, you were in Kenya. When I speak of Africa, I say Africa because I've actually been all over Africa. 2 weeks ago, I was in my 44th African country, Sudan. So my perspective is not shaped by going to 1 or 2 countries and speaking on behalf of the whole continent. My perspective is shaped by Pan-African experience over the last several decades in 44 African countries. Throughout my travels, I've met over 600 young entrepreneurs, men and women who are taking the tools of technology and globalization and are changing their local communities, and some are transforming their countries and others the region. When most people think of the continent, they think of this: natural resources, gold, minerals. And of course, the continent is rich in natural resources. But when young entrepreneurs think of Africa, they think of this. We currently have over 1 billion people. And by the year 2050, we will be 2.5 billion strong. And to get you a sense of what that means, if you look around you, it means 1 in 4 people globally will be African in the next 3 decades. And if the number 2.5 billion still doesn't make sense to you, it basically means on average every month, 30 to 40 million Africans will be born. You contextualize that with the population of Finland, it's a big number. What's happening also is the economy is transforming, it's changing. Whereas back in the day, if you mapped GDP of Africa with commodity pricing, you had almost the same line. You no longer have that. You now have, it's still important, but natural resources contributed less than 1/3 of economic growth since 2000. right? You've had tech increase substantially, services, you've had a diversification of the economy. And importantly, you've had rapid urbanization, right? We actually now have more Africans living in cities with a population greater than 1 million than in North America, just as many as in Europe. Now, how many people here, when I say urbanization, by show of hands, how many people here think they truly understand what that urbanization means? I'm going to show you. This is an intersection in Accra at airport, okay? Over there is where the airport is. If you go down that road, there's a place called Poki's Spot that has the best grilled chicken you ever find in Ghana. When you go to Ghana, go there, tell them I sent you. Now, this picture was taken in 99. Okay, 10 years later, a friend of mine sent a drone. Take a long, hard look at this picture. This exact same spot. Now, do me a favor and close your eyes. Open it. Same place. And if you go down that street, they're still selling the same grilled chicken. This is the transformation that I'm talking about. This is the type of urbanization that we're seeing. And then, of course, finally, we're seeing the mobile technology boom that is creating an Africa that is radically different and unimaginable from 10, 15, 20 years ago. We actually have just as many Africans on the internet today as North America, yet with less than 30% penetration. So with 1 million subscriptions, mobile subscriptions, what happens as the price of smartphones declines and internet penetration increases? Can you imagine an Africa with 70, 80, 90% internet penetration? What does that mean for commerce? What does that mean for education? What does that mean for healthcare? My thesis and what we're seeing is technology is going to disrupt many industries. And I'm going to tell you about 3 startups, 3 entrepreneurs that are doing just that. The first is one of my portfolio companies called Andela. Andela made the news this year because Mark Zuckerberg himself led a round of $24 million in Andela. In fact, when I got the call and they said, Zuckerberg is going to invest, I said, Zuck who? I said, who are these people who are naming themselves after Mark? They said, no, really Mark Zuckerberg, the Facebook guy, wants to invest. I'm like, Mark wants to invest in Africa? This is when I suddenly knew that what we've been saying for the past decade in announcing that the opportunity in Africa is real has been validated by perhaps the greatest tech CEO on the planet. And so what does Andela do? Andela has recognized that there's a war for talent. There's a serious need for developers and coders globally. Andela has also recognized that talent knows no borders and that there are just as many talented developers and coders in Nigeria and in Kenya as there are in Helsinki and in Silicon Valley. And so they've decided to remove these boundaries. We've set up campuses in Nigeria and Kenya, and we're training coders and developers and getting them to then do outsourced work globally. But these developers don't move. They work remotely. And so this is not a brain drain issue where we're training coders and developers and having them move from Lagos and Nairobi to Helsinki and elsewhere. They're staying in their countries, contributing to the local ecosystems and transforming their various countries. And so Andela, with the Zuckerberg investment, we're committed now to training 100,000 developers across Africa in the next 10 years. Now think of what that means for the startup ecosystem to have 100,000 developers. It's going to be extraordinary. The second company, Flutterwave, which, by the way, was started by one of the co-founders of Andela, E. Right? And so this also tells you what happens when you have a successful startup. It spawns on other startups because the founding team goes on to do other great things. So Flutterwave is another portfolio company we invested in, and they're transforming the payments landscape in Africa. Non-cash payments on the continent, $380 billion annually. $380 billion. And there are so many platforms over which so many kinds of mobile money. You have hundreds of different kinds of integrations, different banks, credit cards. You have so many different ways of doing this that if you're a bank and you want to integrate the different ways, it's a headache. So they came out and they said, we're going to create, and they've created, one single API that allows you to send and receive money anywhere across the continent. One API. So you can send money from your credit card, your debit card, to your bank account, mobile money. It does not matter what the platform is. It is platform agnostic. Extraordinary idea, which is now allowing people to transact commerce across the continent. They're already powering global companies like Uber and Facebook, and they're doing extraordinary things. And they've only been in existence for less than a year. Right? This is the kind of innovation and transformation and leapfrogging we are seeing on the continent. And the final company I want to talk about in the portfolio, one of my favorite, one of my highest conviction bets on the continent, is M-Pharma. M-Pharma was started by a young entrepreneur called Gregory Roxon in his 20s. This young man, after he graduated from the US, instead of going to the Bay Area, said, look, I'm going to move home. Because he had a story. A woman in Ghana, in a hospital, had a prescription by a doctor. They went to one pharmacy, the medicine wasn't there, they kept looking for the medicine. By the time they found the drug, 5 hours later, she was dead. It was too late. And he said, this does not make sense. So he initially built M-Pharma with his co-founders as an e-prescription software for us to be able to know in real time the location and availability of medicine. But then it became bigger than that. We realized that we could use our aggregation of hospitals, clinics, pharmacies, and we started signing up drug companies directly. We signed Pfizer, we signed Novartis, and we signed Roche. And we're reducing drug prices by as much as 50%. We just did a deal with Roche where we reduced the price of Herceptin, breast cancer drug, by 50%. We rolled out Muti, which allows us to do micropayments, which says if you cannot pay for the drug up front, we can amortize your payments. And that is radically transforming the payments and the drug space across the continent. We're operating in Nigeria, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Zambia, moving to Kenya, and we're going to be expanding across the continent. So M-Pharma is reducing drug prices, expanding markets for drug companies, giving us critical data that both doctors and providers need, and making drugs cheaper and safer for the consumer. It's a win-win across the board. And that's the kind of an innovation and transformation we're seeing on the continent. And as you walk away, seeing these three examples of disruptive companies, I want to leave you with two additional thoughts before I leave. The first is on female entrepreneurs. Africa actually has the highest rate of female entrepreneurship in the world. More women start businesses in Africa than anywhere else on the continent. And so I think as we go forward, one of the greatest assets the continent will have is a way to tap this hidden resource, a way to be able to leverage our female entrepreneurs who are some of the most enterprising in the world. In fact, in Nigeria and Zambia, there are more female entrepreneurs than male entrepreneurs. And research from McKinsey shows us that female entrepreneurs, on average, reinvest 70 cents of every incremental dollar in their family's health, nutrition, and education, versus 40 cents for men. Because men, they're buying beer with the extra money, right? And so the social benefits of investing in female entrepreneurs is extraordinary. So that's something I think we need to keep in mind. And the final thing, as much as I'm inspired by these entrepreneurs, as much as I feel bullish, and as much as I think we're going to see a radical transformation on the continent, there's a caveat. And that caveat is we cannot out-innovate good governance. We need to match the leapfrogging of entrepreneurship to ensure that we still innovate in governance, we still innovate in the public sector, and we're able to match the strides and the leapfrogging in private entrepreneurship with similar strides and leapfrogging in the public sector. Thank you.